When Navy SEAL Brian returned from his final deployment, he expected to inherit his family ranch. Instead, his greedy half-brother Marcus had secretly sold the land to build a luxury resort. Marcus left Brian with nothing but a rotting shack on a dangerous mountain cliff and a medically discharged, three-legged military dog named Rex. Marcus laughed, calling the dog a broken, useless thing. He believed Brian would freeze and give up, but he forgot one crucial detail. You never back a trained soldier and a combat dog into a corner. When a catastrophic storm hits the mountain, Marcus's concrete empire collapses under a massive landslide, trapping dozens of wealthy guests in the dark. Suddenly, the billionaire's only hope for survival rests in the hands of the brother he betrayed and the dog he threw away. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments which country you are watching from, and if you love stories that melt your heart, please subscribe to support our channel. Brian stepped off the bus into the biting cold of Aspen, Colorado. The winter air hit his face like crushed glass. He carried one canvas duffel bag. It held everything he owned after 12 years of active duty as a Navy SEAL. He had broad shoulders, calloused hands, and eyes that constantly scanned the perimeter. He wore a simple dark jacket and faded jeans. He had come home because his father died. He had come home to take over the family ranch. He walked 3 miles from the station to the property line. The snow crunched beneath his boots. He remembered the wooden fence, the red barn, and the smell of pine and horses. He expected silence. He expected the heavy peace of the mountains. Instead, he heard the roar of diesel engines. Brian stopped at the edge of the valley. The wooden fence was gone. The red barn was a pile of splintered wood. Yellow bulldozers tore through the frozen earth. Surveyors in bright vests marked the ground with neon flags. A massive billboard stood near the entrance. It read, "Pinnacle Peak Luxury Resort, coming soon." Brian did not drop his bag. He did not shout. He walked down the dirt path toward a temporary office trailer. A man stepped out of the trailer. It was Marcus. Marcus was Brian's half-brother. He was 3 years older. He wore a custom-tailored gray suit under a heavy wool coat. His hair was slicked back. He had a sharp jawline and an arrogant smile that never reached his eyes. Marcus had never worked a day on the dirt. He preferred spreadsheets and boardrooms. "You are late, little brother," Marcus said. He held a ceramic coffee cup. "Where is the house?" Brian asked. His voice was flat. "Demolished on Tuesday," Marcus replied. He took a sip of his coffee. The development group needed the land cleared before the hard freeze sets in. Brian stepped closer. "Dad left the ranch to both of us. You cannot sell it without my signature." Marcus smiled. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded document. He handed it to Brian. "Dad left the property to the family trust. You were deployed. You missed the probate hearings. I was named sole executor. The trust had debts. I liquidated the primary asset to clear the debts and maximize returns for the estate. It is completely legal. The resort developers paid a premium." Brian read the paper. The legal jargon was dense. The conclusion was simple. Marcus had used his absence to restructure the trust. Marcus sold the land. Marcus kept the money. Brian had nothing. "You stole it," Brian said. "I optimized it." Marcus corrected him. "This land was wasted on horses and sentiment. Now it will be a 5-star destination." People who steal legacies rarely understand the weight of the dirt they stand on. They only see the price tag. Marcus looked at the bulldozers with pride. Brian looked at the torn earth with grief. "You have no legal standing, Brian. My lawyers made sure of that," Marcus said. He turned and walked toward the back of the trailer. "But I am not heartless. Dad owned a secondary parcel, the ridge lot up by the tree line. The developers did not want it. The terrain is too unstable for construction. It is yours." Marcus reached into his pocket again. He tossed a rusty key ring into the snow at Brian's feet. "There is a hunting shack on it," Marcus said. "It has a roof. That is all you get." Brian looked down at the keys. He did not pick them up immediately. "Oh, and I have something else for you," Marcus added. He walked to a metal crate sitting near the trailer steps. He unlatched the door. A dog stepped out. It was a German shepherd. The dog had a dull, matted coat. Its ribs showed through its fur. The animal kept its left hind leg lifted off the ground, avoiding putting weight on it. The dog looked up. Its eyes were sharp, intelligent, and deeply tired. "They dropped him off yesterday," Marcus explained. "Military transport. Said his name is Rex. Medically discharged, shrapnel in the leg, the handler died, and the dog is supposedly aggressive. They were going to put him down, but his paperwork got routed to Dad's address since Dad bred his father." Marcus looked at the dog with disgust. "He is useless. Cannot run. Cannot work. Just another broken thing. Take him with you. If he is still here tomorrow, I am calling animal control." Brian looked at Rex. Rex looked back. The dog did not growl. He just stood there, shivering in the cold, favoring his injured leg. Two veterans, both cast aside, both told they had no value left. Brian crouched down in the snow. He held out his hand. He did not rush. He let the dog sniff his knuckles. Rex hesitated. Then the dog leaned his heavy head against Brian's palm. Brian picked up the rusty keys. He stood up. He did not look at Marcus again. He did not need to. Anger was a wasted emotion on a battlefield. Survival required focus. "Come on, Rex," Brian said softly. The dog limped forward. Brian adjusted the strap of his duffel bag. He turned away from the construction site and started walking up the mountain toward the tree line. The wind blew harder. The temperature dropped. The ridge lot was steep and barren. The shack Marcus mentioned was miles away, hidden in the dense pine forest. Marcus watched them go. He laughed quietly. He went back inside his heated trailer. He thought he had won. He thought he had eliminated the only threat to his new empire. He believed a man with nothing and a dog with a broken leg would freeze to death or give up and leave town. He was wrong. He did not understand what 12 years of special operations training does to a man. He did not understand that stripped of comfort, a soldier finds his true element. Brian walked steadily up the incline. Rex stayed right beside him, matching his pace despite the limp. The resort faded into the distance behind them. The noise of the engines was replaced by the sound of the wind in the pines. The sun began to set, casting long, cold shadows across the snow. They reached the ridge just before dark. The shack stood at the edge of a cliff. The roof sagged, the windows were cracked. The wooden walls were rotted at the base. It offered almost no protection from the winter elements. Brian pushed the door open. The inside smelled like dust and damp wood. There was a rusted wood stove in the corner and a broken cot against the wall. Nothing else. Brian set his bag on the floor. He knelt beside Rex. He examined the dog's leg gently. The joint was stiff, the muscle atrophied, but it was not completely ruined. It just needed time, care, and discipline. "We start tomorrow," Brian told the dog. Rex thumped his tail once against the floorboards. Brian began gathering dry wood from under the porch to start a fire. The estate was gone. The money was gone. The past was gone. But Brian still had his hands. He still had his mind. And now he had a partner. They were at the bottom of the mountain, left with nothing. But a seal knows that the bottom is just the foundation for a climb. The cold woke Brian before the sun did. The shack had no insulation. The wind pushed through the gaps in the floorboards and cut across the single room. The fire in the rusted stove had died out hours ago. Brian lay on the broken cot for a moment. He looked at the ceiling. The wood was water-stained and rotting. He listened to the mountain. It was quiet, but it was a heavy quiet. He sat up. He did not pull the blanket tighter. He pushed it off. A Navy SEAL learns early that comfort is a liability. You do not wait for the environment to warm up. You force your body to generate the heat. Brian put his boots on. He looked at the corner of the room. Rex was curled into a tight ball on an old piece of canvas. The dog was shivering. His breath plumed in the freezing air. Brian walked to the stove. He cleaned the ash. He laid small pieces of dry pine over crumpled paper. He struck a match. The fire caught. He added larger pieces of wood until the metal of the stove began to radiate heat. He did not go to the dog right away. He established the baseline first. Heat, shelter, security. Then he walked over to the canvas. Rex lifted his head. The dog did not wag his tail. He watched Brian with careful eyes. Brian knelt. He reached out and placed his hand firmly on the dog's neck. He did not pet him like a house dog. He touched him like a soldier. "Time to work," Brian said. People believe healing requires comfort. They are wrong. Healing requires purpose. It requires motion when sitting still is easier. A body at rest forgets how to fight. Brian knew this because the military had rebuilt him twice. Now, he had to rebuild the dog. Brian moved his hands down Rex's back, feeling the spine, the ribs, and the muscle tone. He reached the left hind leg. Rex flinched. The dog pulled the leg away and let out a low growl. Brian did not pull his hand back. He held his ground. He applied steady, gentle pressure to the joint. The leg was a mess of scar tissue. Shrapnel had torn through the muscle bellies. The veterinarians had saved the limb, but they had not saved the function. The military saw a liability. Brian saw atrophy. The muscle had shrunk because the dog refused to use it. The pain created fear, and the fear created weakness. Brian began to massage the scar tissue. He used his thumbs to break up the stiff fascia. It hurt. Rex bared his teeth. Brian looked the dog directly in the eyes. "Steady," Brian commanded softly. Rex held his gaze. The dog's breathing slowed. He stopped pulling away. He accepted the pain because he understood the authority behind it. For 20 minutes, Brian worked the leg. He moved the joint through its limited range of motion. He flexed the paw. He extended the knee. When he finished, he stood up. "Outside," Brian said. Rex struggled to stand. He hopped on 3 legs toward the door. Brian opened it. The morning air was brutal. The snow from yesterday had frozen into a hard crust. Brian walked out. Rex followed. They started a routine. The routine was the only thing that kept the cold from winning. Wake up, build the fire, massage the leg, walk the perimeter. For the first 5 days, Rex only walked 50 yards before sitting down in the snow. Brian did not carry him back. He waited. He stood in the freezing wind until Rex decided to stand up and walk back on his own. By day 10, 50 yards became 200. Brian started forcing Rex to walk on uneven ground. He made the dog step over fallen branches. Every time Rex tried to lift the injured leg and hop, Brian stopped walking. He waited until Rex put the paw down. The progress was slow. It was ugly, but it was progress. They ate cheap rice and canned beans. Brian spent his dwindling cash at a small supply store in the valley, avoiding the resort side of the mountain. He bought high-protein dog food. He fed Rex before he fed himself. The dog's coat slowly lost its dullness. The ribs stopped showing. The eyes grew sharper. On the 14th day, the sky turned the color of bruised iron. The wind died down completely. The temperature plummeted 15 degrees in an hour. Brian was outside chopping wood. He knew the signs. A major front was moving in. A whiteout blizzard was hours away. He swung the axe, splitting a thick log in 2. Rex was sitting on the porch. Suddenly, the dog stood up. Rex did not look at Brian. He looked toward the deep woods to the north. His ears pinned forward. The hair on his spine stood up. He let out a sharp bark. Brian stopped chopping. He looked north. He saw nothing but dense pine trees and gray shadows. Rex limped off the porch. He put his nose to the frozen ground. He moved past the woodpile. He looked back at Brian. The dog barked again. It was a specific sound. It was the alert bark of a working dog who had found a scent. Brian dropped the axe. He grabbed his coat, a heavy flashlight, and a coil of rope from inside the shack. He ran out and followed the dog. Rex moved faster than he had in 2 weeks. He forced weight onto his bad leg, ignoring the limp. The scent was pulling him forward. Brian stayed right behind him. They pushed through thick brush and deep snowdrifts. The terrain grew steeper. The first flakes of snow began to fall. They tracked for a mile. The wind picked up, erasing the tracks behind them. If they went too far, they would not find their way back. Brian knew the risk. He trusted the dog. Rex stopped at the edge of a ravine. He barked aggressively down into the steep drop. Brian moved to the edge. He looked down. 30 feet below, lodged against a dead tree, was a person. Brian tied the rope around a sturdy pine. He rappelled down the snowy embankment. He reached the bottom. It was a young man named David. He was 20 years old. He wore a lightweight nylon jacket and running shoes. His face was pale. His lips were blue. His right ankle was swollen to the size of a grapefruit. He was shivering uncontrollably. David had wandered off the marked trails from the valley. He had fallen. He was dying of hypothermia. "Look at me," Brian said. He grabbed David by the shoulders. "You are going to live, but you have to move." Brian did not waste time. He hoisted David up. He used the rope to drag and push the young man up the steep embankment. It took 20 minutes of brutal physical exertion. When they reached the top, the snow was falling heavily. Visibility was dropping to 0. The whiteout had arrived. Brian could not see the trees 10 feet away. He could not see the path back to the shack. He looked at Rex. The dog was covered in snow, panting heavily. "Find home, Rex," Brian ordered. Rex put his nose down. The dog did not hesitate. He moved forward into the blinding white wall of snow. Brian threw David's arm over his shoulder and followed the dog. They walked blind. The wind screamed in their ears. The cold gnawed at their bones. Brian only watched the dog's tail ahead of him. 40 minutes later, the dark shape of the shack appeared through the snow. They got inside. Brian secured the door. He dragged David to the cot and piled every blanket over him. He stoked the fire until the stove glowed red. He boiled water. He forced David to drink. Slowly, the color returned to the young man's face. The violent shivering subsided. David fell into an exhausted sleep. Brian sat on the floor with his back against the wall. His muscles ached. He was freezing. He looked across the room. Rex was lying near the stove. The dog was licking his bad leg. He looked up at Brian. Marcus had called this dog a broken thing. The military had called him a liability. Brian looked at the animal that had just navigated a deadly whiteout on 3 good legs and saved a human life. Rex was not broken. He was a weapon that just needed recalibration. Brian leaned his head back against the wall. He closed his eyes. They had a roof. They had fire. And they had a purpose. The mountain had tried to kill them, and they had won. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. David left the mountain 2 days later. The local search and rescue team brought a snowmobile up the logging road to get him. They looked at the shack. They looked at Brian. They did not ask questions. Men who survive blizzards in uninsulated cabins usually want to be left alone. Before David rode away, he looked at Rex. The dog sat on the porch, favoring his left leg, watching the snowmobile. David handed Brian a folded piece of paper. It was a check for $5,000. David said his father owned a software company. He said the money was for the dog. Brian put the check in his pocket. He did not say, "Thank you." He just nodded. Brian looked at the check that night by the light of the wood stove. $5,000 bought food, firewood, and winter gear. It did not buy a future. A man without a mission is just waiting to die. Brian needed a mission. He looked at Rex. The dog had tracked a dying man through a blizzard on 3 legs. The military called him broken. Brian knew better. The world is full of broken things that still work perfectly if you know how to fix them. The next morning, Brian started building. He did not buy lumber. He used the forest. He chopped down dead pines. He dragged them to the clearing behind the shack. He used rope to lash the logs together. He built a climbing wall, a low-crawl obstacle, and a fire-building station. He worked for 10 days straight. His hands bled. The temperature never rose above freezing. Rex stayed beside him. The dog's leg grew stronger every day. The work gave the dog a rhythm. When the course was finished, Brian walked down the mountain. He went to the valley town. He bought a cheap, prepaid smartphone and sat in the local coffee shop. He created a simple website. He called it Ridgeline Tactical Survival. He listed 2 instructors, himself and Rex. He did not write a long biography. He listed his 12 years as a Navy SEAL and Rex's combat tracking experience. He set the price at $500 per person for a weekend course. He walked back up the mountain. 3 days later, a man wearing a bright yellow resort jacket hiked up the trail to the shack. His name was Greg. Greg was a security supervisor for Pinnacle Peak Luxury Resort. He was 50 years old, overweight, and breathed heavily from the climb. Greg liked authority but lacked the discipline to earn it. Greg stopped at the edge of the clearing. He looked at the log structures. He pulled an envelope from his jacket. "Brian," Greg said, catching his breath, "your brother sent me." Marcus says, "You are running a commercial enterprise on residential property." He says it violates the zoning agreement of the estate. Brian was chopping wood. He did not stop swinging the axe. The blade bit deep into the pine block. The sound cracked through the cold air. "The ridge lot is unzoned," Brian said. He pulled the axe free. "It is outside the municipal boundary. Marcus knows that." "He also said to give you this," Greg said. He held out the envelope. "It is a formal warning about trespassing on resort land. If your clients cross the property line, we will call the sheriff." Brian set the axe down. He walked over to Greg. He moved with the silent, heavy grace of a predator. Greg took a step back. Brian took the envelope. He did not open it. He folded it in half and put it in his pocket. "Tell Marcus the line is marked," Brian said. "Tell him to stay on his side." Greg did not say anything else. He turned and walked back down the trail quickly. Brian watched him go. He knew Marcus was not worried about zoning. Marcus was annoyed that Brian had not quit. Marcus wanted Brian to fail quietly. Brian intended to succeed loudly. The first clients arrived the following Saturday. There were 4 of them. They were software developers from Denver. They wore expensive, brand-new outdoor gear. They had soft hands and nervous smiles. One of them was a woman named Sarah. Sarah was 30 years old, sharp and skeptical. She looked at the rotting shack and the 3-legged dog. She looked like she wanted her money back. "Is this it?" Sarah asked. "This is it," Brian said. "Leave your phones in your cars. Grab your packs." Brian did not give a welcome speech. He led them directly into the woods. He set a brutal pace. He wanted to break their comfort zones immediately. For the first 4 hours, he taught them land navigation without a compass. He taught them how to read the moss on the trees and the direction of the wind. They stumbled, they complained. Sarah fell into a snowdrift and cursed. Brian did not help her up. He waited until she stood up herself. At noon, he stopped in a dense thicket of pines. "Fire is life," Brian told them. "You have 10 minutes to build a fire using only what you can find in a 10-foot radius. If you fail, we do not eat lunch." They failed. They gathered wet wood. They panicked. The 10 minutes passed. Brian did not give them extra time. He made them sit in the cold while he built a fire in 2 minutes using dry bark and a magnesium striker. He cooked cheap sausages over the open flame. The smell tortured them. "Survival does not care about your effort," Brian said as he ate. "It only cares about results." In the afternoon, Brian introduced them to Rex. He gave Sarah a piece of cloth. He told her to run into the woods for 15 minutes and hide. He told her to make it difficult. Sarah took the cloth and ran. She was angry. She wanted to prove him wrong. She waded through a frozen creek to mask her scent. She climbed a steep embankment and hid under a fallen tree covered in snow. Brian waited exactly 15 minutes. He brought Rex to the edge of the woods. He let the dog sniff the spot where Sarah had stood. "Find," Brian said. Rex dropped his nose. The dog did not run blindly. He moved with terrifying precision. He tracked the scent through the snow. He reached the creek. The water had washed the tracks away. Rex did not panic. He walked up the bank, lifting his head to catch the scent in the wind. He found it. He pushed through the thick brush, ignoring his bad leg. He moved like a guided missile. 10 minutes later, Rex stopped at the fallen tree. He let out a sharp bark. Brian arrived a minute later. Sarah crawled out from under the branches. She was covered in snow. She looked at the dog. She looked at Brian. Her skepticism was gone. It was replaced by absolute awe. "He tracked me through the water," Sarah said. Her voice shook slightly. "How?" "He focuses on the mission," Brian said. "He ignores the distractions." They spent the night in the freezing cold. Brian taught them how to build thermal shelters using pine boughs and snow. They shivered, they suffered, but they learned. When they hiked down the mountain on Sunday afternoon, they were exhausted, dirty, and bruised. But they walked taller. They had survived. Sarah stopped before getting into her car. She looked at Brian and Rex standing on the ridge. She did not ask for a refund. 2 days later, Sarah wrote a review on a massive adventure travel forum. She did not describe a luxury vacation. She described a grueling, authentic experience led by a real operator and a miraculous dog. She called it the most profound weekend of her life. Brian's phone started ringing the next morning. It did not stop. Sarah's review acted like a flare shot into the dark night of the internet. Brian's cheap, prepaid phone vibrated on the wooden table inside the shack. Then it vibrated again. By noon on Monday, he had 80 voicemails. He listened to them while chopping wood. People from cities across the country wanted to book a spot. They did not want luxury. They wanted something real. The modern world makes people soft. It wraps them in temperature control, digital validation, and artificial safety. Deep down, people know this. They crave the friction of the natural world. They want to know if they can survive when the lights go out. Brian offered them that answer. Brian took the money from the first few courses and reinvested it immediately. He did not buy a better heater for himself. He bought surplus military canvas tents. He bought heavy climbing ropes, medical kits, and compasses. He expanded the course from 4 people to 12 people per weekend. Rex became the heart of the operation. The dog no longer limped. The brutal daily routine had forced the muscles in his left hind leg to rebuild themselves thick and hard. The shrapnel scars remained visible under his coat, but he moved with the lethal grace of a predator. Rex demonstrated tracking. He demonstrated perimeter defense. When a client wanted to quit during the night march, Brian did not yell. He simply brought Rex over. He let the exhausted client look at the dog who had nearly been euthanized for being broken. The clients looked at Rex, swallowed their complaints, and stood back up. During the 6th week, a man named Tom registered for the course. Tom was 55 years old. He had gray hair, a weathered face, and sharp eyes. He did not tell Brian he was a senior editor for a national adventure magazine. He paid his fee and carried his own pack. Tom suffered through the freezing rain. He slipped in the mud. He watched Brian build a fire in a torrential downpour using only dead bark and a spark. He watched Rex find a hidden cache of rations buried beneath a foot of snow in under 3 minutes. On the final night, Tom sat by the fire and pulled out a small waterproof notebook. He introduced himself. He asked Brian why he lived in a shack when he could easily consult for private security firms in the city. Brian did not talk about his brother. He did not talk about the stolen inheritance. He looked at Rex resting by the flames. "Broken things just need a mission," Brian said. "The military threw him away. My family threw me away. We just found a place where the rules are honest. This is the truth about human nature. The world often discards what it does not understand. True leaders find the hidden utility in the discarded and forge it into something unbreakable. Tom wrote that exact thought down in his notebook. Down in the valley, Pinnacle Peak Luxury Resort was expanding at a reckless pace. Marcus wanted the main lodge and the luxury cabins finished before the prestigious winter gala. The gala was supposed to attract billionaire investors. Marcus ordered the excavation crews to cut deeper into the mountainside. He wanted a wider access road for the black cars and luxury SUVs. A geological surveyor named Helen arrived at the resort on a Tuesday morning. Helen was 40 years old. She wore steel-toed boots and carried a tablet filled with topographical maps. She stood in Marcus's temporary, heated office. She dropped a printed report on his desk. Helen told Marcus the soil on the lower ridge was unstable. She explained that cutting the ancient pine trees removed the deep root systems that held the mudstone and soil together. She warned him that the upcoming season predicted heavy, unseasonable rains before the hard freeze. "If you keep cutting into that slope, you are creating a landslide risk," Helen said. "The water will have nowhere to go. It will liquefy the soil." Marcus did not look at the report. He looked at his watch. He told Helen that his structural engineers had already signed off on the retaining walls. "Engineers do not control gravity," Helen replied sharply. "Concrete walls will snap like chalk if the mountain decides to move." Marcus fired her consulting firm that afternoon. He did not want warnings. He wanted progress. He hired a cheaper surveyor who was willing to sign the permits without asking difficult questions. The chainsaws kept running. The bulldozers kept digging. The mountain lost more of its anchor every single day. Tom's article hit the newsstands and the internet in early November. It was the cover story. The headline read, "The Seal, the Dog, and the Honest Dirt." The article did not just describe a survival course, it described a philosophy. It painted Brian as a raw, authentic leader, standing against the tide of modern softness. It painted Rex as a miracle of resilience. The response was explosive. Within 24 hours of the publication, Ridgeline Tactical Survival was booked solid for the next 2 years. Brian's inbox was flooded. He had to hire 2 fellow military veterans just to help manage the logistics and the wait list. The money poured in. It was clean money. It was earned through sweat and discipline. Marcus saw the magazine in a luxury grocery store in town. He bought a copy. He sat in the driver's seat of his expensive SUV and read it. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. He had taken the family trust. He had taken the valuable land. He had forced his brother into a rotting shack on a barren cliff. He had expected Brian to freeze, fail, or beg for help. Instead, Brian had turned a piece of garbage land and a crippled dog into a national phenomenon. Marcus felt a cold, hard knot of jealousy twist in his stomach. He looked through his windshield up at the ridge. He hated the shack. He hated the dog. Most of all, he hated that his brother did not need him. Marcus crumpled the magazine and threw it into the passenger seat. He picked up his phone and called his foreman, ordering the crews to work through the night. He needed his resort to be bigger. He needed to prove he was the winner. Up on the ridge, Brian did not care about the magazine. He was busy tying a rope around a massive log. Rex barked, ready for the morning run. The sky above them was turning a strange, deep purple. The unseasonable rains were coming. The rain did not start as a drizzle. It hit the mountain like a physical blow. The deep purple sky broke open, and a relentless gray wall of water fell upon Aspen. It rained for 3 straight days. The temperature hovered just above freezing, turning the precipitation into a heavy, freezing deluge. Brian sat inside the shack. The old roof leaked in 4 places. He placed metal buckets under the drips. The rhythmic sound of water hitting metal echoed in the small room. Rex lay near the wood stove. The dog was restless. His ears twitched at every gust of wind. Brian put on his heavy canvas raincoat. He opened the door and stepped outside into the storm. The ground beneath his boots felt wrong. Usually, the mountain soil absorbed the rain. The deep roots of the ancient pines drank the water and held the earth firm. But the lower ridge had been stripped of its trees. The natural drainage was destroyed. The water pooled into thick, unstable mud. Mountains do not give warnings with words. They speak in mud, shifting rocks, and the unnatural silence of wildlife. A smart man listens. A greedy man talks over it. Brian walked along the edge of the tree line. He looked down toward the resort. The massive excavation cuts that Marcus had ordered were completely exposed to the rain. The freshly poured concrete retaining walls looked clean, but Brian saw the truth. Water was cascading over the tops of the walls. Deep fissures were forming in the soil just behind the concrete. Gravity and water were a lethal combination. Brian walked back to the shack. He picked up his prepaid phone. He had a group of 8 clients scheduled to arrive the next morning. He typed a single message and sent it to all of them. Course canceled. Extreme weather hazard. Full refunds issued today. He did not hesitate. He did not care about the lost revenue. Survival is about mitigating unnecessary risk. A dead client cannot learn how to start a fire. Brian knew that nature always collected her debts. The resort was a massive debt waiting to be called in. He looked at Rex. "Stay," Brian commanded. The dog whined softly but laid his head down on his paws. Brian pulled his hood up and started the long hike down the mountain. The trail was treacherous. Mud slid over the rocks. Brian kept his balance, reading the terrain with the cold calculation of a soldier. He reached the valley floor. Pinnacle Peak Luxury Resort was a hive of frantic activity despite the storm. Massive white event tents flapped violently in the wind. Delivery trucks idled near the loading docks. Caterers rushed boxes of expensive food inside. Tonight was the grand opening gala. Brian walked through the main automatic doors of the newly finished lodge. The contrast was jarring. The lobby smelled like expensive wood polish and fresh lilies. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling. Brian left a trail of dark mud on the pristine marble floor. Marcus stood in the center of the lobby. He wore a custom black tuxedo. His hair was perfectly styled. He was yelling at a man holding a clipboard. The man was Carter. Carter was the regional manager for the catering company. He was thin, pale, and looked entirely overwhelmed by the chaos of the event. "I do not care if the delivery truck is stuck," Marcus yelled at Carter. "Get the truffles here by 7 o'clock or you are fired." Carter nodded frantically and ran toward the kitchens. Marcus turned and saw Brian. The anger on his face morphed into a look of absolute disgust. "Look at my floor," Marcus said. He gestured to the mud. "You are trespassing. Get out." Brian walked closer. He ignored the mud. He ignored the tuxedo. "The slope above your new cabins is completely saturated," Brian said. His voice was calm, cutting through the noise of the lobby. "The water has nowhere to empty. The soil is liquefying behind your retaining walls. You need to evacuate this building." Marcus laughed. It was a sharp, mocking sound. He pointed out the massive glass window toward the mountain. "My structural engineers signed off on those walls yesterday," Marcus said. "We spent $2 million on concrete. It will hold." "Engineers calculate dry weight," Brian replied. "They did not calculate a 100-year rainstorm hitting a stripped hillside. The earth is shifting. I saw the fissures." Marcus stepped into Brian's space. "You saw mud. You live in a shack and play soldier in the dirt. Tonight, the governor is coming. 3 billionaires are arriving in private cars. I am about to launch the premier destination in Colorado. You are just trying to ruin it because you have nothing." Brian did not flinch. He looked at his brother. He saw a man entirely blinded by ego. He saw a man who believed money could negotiate with nature. "The mountain is liquid," Brian stated simply. "If you put those VIPs down in the basement banquet hall tonight, you will drown them. Cancel the event." "Security!" Marcus shouted. 2 large men in black suits started walking across the lobby. Brian did not wait for them. He had delivered the warning. That was his only obligation. He turned around and walked out the glass doors, stepping back into the freezing rain. The hike back up the mountain took twice as long. The mud was thicker. The wind howled through the pines. By the time Brian reached the shack, darkness had fallen completely. He was soaked to the bone. He locked the door. He stripped off his wet jacket and built up the fire. The flames roared, casting erratic shadows on the wooden walls. Rex was not sleeping. The German shepherd was pacing back and forth across the small room. The dog ignored his food bowl. He ignored the warmth of the stove. "Settle down, Rex," Brian said. Rex did not listen. This was highly unusual. The dog had impeccable discipline. Since the blizzard, Rex had never shown signs of panic. Around 9 o'clock at night, the rain hit a fever pitch. It sounded like a freight train roaring directly above the roof. The wind battered the thin walls of the shack. Suddenly, Rex stopped pacing. The dog stood dead center in the room. His muscles went completely rigid. He stared intensely at the floorboards. Then he began to dig. He clawed frantically at the solid wood floor, ripping splinters from the planks. Brian stood up. He recognized the behavior. It was the same frantic energy Rex used when he found a buried target. But there was nothing under the floor. Rex stopped digging. He ran to the front door. He scratched violently at the wood. He turned his head, looked directly at Brian, and let out a continuous, piercing bark. It was not a warning bark. It was an alarm. Brian felt it then. It traveled up through the soles of his boots, a deep, subsonic vibration. It was not thunder. Thunder comes from the sky and shakes the windows. This came from deep within the earth, shaking the very foundation of the world. The mountain was moving. The deep vibration beneath the floorboards grew into a deafening roar. It sounded like the earth itself was tearing apart. Brian grabbed his heavy gear bag from the corner of the room. He clipped a thick nylon leash onto Rex's collar. He did not wait inside the shack to see what would happen. A wooden box sitting on a cliff is nothing but a coffin during a landslide. He stepped out into the freezing rain and moved immediately to the high, rocky ground above the tree line. He looked down into the valley below. The darkness was absolute, but the terrible sound painted a clear picture in his mind. The mountain was giving way, sliding down toward the resort. Down at Pinnacle Peak Luxury Resort, the grand opening gala was at its absolute peak. The massive basement banquet hall was filled with soft classical music, expensive imported champagne, and the loud, confident laughter of wealthy investors. Women wore elegant silk gowns. Men wore custom-tailored suits. Waiters moved silently among the beautifully decorated tables, carrying silver trays filled with gourmet food. Marcus stood near the grand marble staircase in the main lobby, directly above the basement hall. He held a glass of expensive scotch. He smiled warmly at a local politician, shaking the man's hand. He felt completely victorious in that moment. He had built a massive financial empire on stolen land, and the entire world was applauding him for his brilliant vision. Then the bright lights flickered. The soft music cut out completely. A violent, sickening shudder ripped through the solid marble floor. The politicians and the billionaires stopped laughing. The heavy crystal chandeliers swayed wildly overhead, smashing into each other. A low, grinding noise echoed from the back of the luxury lodge. It was the terrifying sound of $2 million worth of reinforced concrete failing completely under impossible pressure. The retaining walls snapped like dry twigs. Millions of tons of liquefied soil, massive granite boulders, and uprooted ancient pine trees slammed into the back of the resort with the force of a moving freight train. The impact shattered the reinforced glass windows in a single instant. A black, freezing wave of mud and debris flooded directly into the pristine lobby. It carried away heavy wooden furniture, expensive bronze sculptures, and screaming people. Marcus was thrown backward violently against the grand staircase railing. The cold, thick mud filled his mouth and lungs. He gasped wildly for air, grabbing the solid wooden banister as the flood of earth rushed past him, threatening to pull him under. The main lodge groaned under the immense weight of the mountain. The floor buckled upward. The mud did not stop in the lobby. It poured heavily down the grand staircase, acting like a dark, suffocating waterfall. It crashed directly into the basement banquet hall below. Terrified screams erupted from the darkness beneath Marcus. Then, the heavy double-oak doors of the basement hall buckled and slammed tightly shut under the sheer pressure of the mud, sealing all the guests inside. The emergency backup generators tried to kick on automatically, but the mud had already swallowed the electrical room entirely. The entire resort went completely dark. Panic strips a man of his fancy titles and his tailored suits, leaving only the raw, ugly truth of his character exposed to the harsh elements. Marcus pulled himself up the stairs, covered from head to toe in freezing mud. His custom tuxedo was torn to shreds. His expensive leather shoes were gone. He stood heavily on the upper landing and looked down at his ruined empire. The beautiful lobby was now a deadly swamp of debris. The luxury cabins outside were smashed into tiny splinters. He heard muffled, desperate screams coming from beneath the thick floor. 30 VIP guests were trapped in the basement. The limited air supply would not last long under the crushing weight of the wet earth and debris. Marcus stumbled blindly outside through a shattered window frame. The freezing rain continued to beat down on his face. He ran toward the security office building. It was partially collapsed. He found Greg, the security supervisor, pulling himself out of the rubble. "Call the fire department," Marcus screamed hysterically over the raging storm. "Call the state police. Get the rescue helicopters here right now." Greg wiped thick blood from his forehead. He held up a crushed satellite radio. "The main access road is completely washed out," Greg yelled back. "A full mile of the highway is gone. No fire trucks can get up here. Helicopters cannot fly in a storm with zero visibility. We are completely cut off from the world." Marcus looked around the dark ruins in absolute terror. He saw the expensive excavation equipment parked safely near the tree line. "Start the bulldozers. We have to dig them out of the basement. The mud is 10 feet deep and still moving," Greg said. "Heavy machinery will just sink instantly and trigger another fatal slide. We cannot touch it." Millions of dollars in modern technology and heavy equipment were entirely useless. The mountain had violently reclaimed its territory, and it did not care about Marcus's wealth or influence. He was completely helpless. The people in the basement were going to die, and he was going to be responsible for it. His massive arrogance had built their concrete tomb. Marcus looked up the dark mountain. Through the driving rain, he saw a faint, flickering light high on the ridge. It was the simple gas lantern hanging on the porch of the old hunting shack. He knew what he had to do. The only person on the mountain who actually understood how to navigate a lethal disaster was the brother he had callously discarded. Marcus started climbing. The marked trail was totally gone. He crawled on his bare hands and knees through the freezing, sliding mud. The heavy rain blinded him. The sharp rocks cut deeply into his hands. He slipped and slid backward multiple times, but absolute desperation drove him forward. He climbed for an hour, fighting the very mountain he had arrogantly tried to conquer. He lost his coat along the way. He was freezing, bleeding, and entirely broken. Brian stood silently on the porch of the shack. He watched the dark figure crawl weakly over the edge of the ridge. Rex stood right beside him, perfectly still, watching the man approach with sharp eyes. Marcus collapsed onto the wet wooden planks of the porch. He was totally unrecognizable. He was covered thickly in black mud and red blood. He looked up at Brian. He did not see a man he had defeated. He saw his absolute last hope. "They are trapped," Marcus gasped. His voice cracked badly. He was openly sobbing. "The basement. The mud buried the doors. The roof is going to cave in soon. The emergency crews cannot get here." Brian looked down at his brother. He did not smile. He did not gloat. A real soldier never takes pleasure in the destruction of human life. even the life of an arrogant enemy. "I warned you," Brian said. His voice was steady, calm, and cold. "I know!" Marcus cried out. He forced himself up onto his shaking knees. The wealthy, powerful developer knelt humbly in the dirt before the brother he had brutally robbed. "I was totally wrong. I took everything from you. I admit it. But please, there are innocent people down there. They are suffocating in the dark. I cannot save them. Only you can." Marcus pressed his bleeding hands against the muddy floorboards. He lowered his head completely. "Save them, Brian," Marcus begged. "Please." Brian looked at Rex. The dog looked back, waiting eagerly for the command. Brian reached inside the shack and grabbed his heavy tactical pack. He slung it over his broad shoulder. He grabbed a steel pry bar and a thick coil of heavy climbing rope. He walked right past his brother. "Stay here," Brian told Marcus. "You are a liability." Brian stepped off the porch and disappeared into the raging storm, heading straight into the heart of the disaster. Rex followed closely at his heels. They did not walk like helpless victims. They moved with purpose, like an elite rescue team. The mountain had fallen, but they were ready to answer the call. The storm raged blindly as Brian and Rex descended the mountain. Brian did not take the washed-out trail. He took the direct route down the rocky cliff face. He trusted his boots. He trusted the heavy climbing rope. He trusted the dog moving beside him. They reached the valley floor in 20 minutes. The Pinnacle Peak Luxury Resort was a graveyard of shattered wood and wet earth. The lobby was entirely destroyed. The mud flow had pushed straight through the building and piled heavily over the rear exit. The basement banquet hall was buried underneath 10 feet of liquefied soil. Brian walked into the ruins of the main floor. The silence beneath the howling wind was unnatural. The earth does not care about the wealth of the men it buries. In the dark, a billionaire and a beggar share the exact same value. Nature only respects survival. Brian stopped above the approximate location of the basement doors. The mud was too thick to dig through by hand. Heavy machinery would trigger another collapse. He needed a precise entry point. He looked at Rex. "Find them," Brian commanded. Rex dropped his nose to the ruined marble floor. The dog ignored the freezing rain pouring through the shattered ceiling. He ignored the smell of ruptured gas lines and broken sewer pipes. He focused entirely on the faint scent of human breath filtering up through the microscopic cracks in the foundation. Rex paced slowly across the debris. His bad leg did not falter. He reached a corner of the lobby near the collapsed electrical room. He stopped. He began to dig furiously at a pile of splintered drywall and thick mud. He let out a sharp, continuous bark. Brian ran to the spot. He cleared the debris with his bare hands. Beneath the mud was a metal grating. It was an old ventilation shaft that Marcus's construction crew had built over but failed to remove. It connected directly to the ceiling of the basement hall. Brian wedged the heavy steel pry bar into the edge of the grate. He pulled back with all his strength. His muscles burned. The metal groaned heavily. The rusty bolt snapped under the extreme pressure. Brian threw the grate aside. A rush of warm, stale air hit his face. He shined his heavy flashlight down the shaft. He saw the terrified faces of 30 people looking up at him from the darkness. "Listen to me," Brian shouted down the hole. His voice carried absolute authority. "The structural integrity is failing. We have exactly 10 minutes before the ceiling collapses completely. I am dropping a rope. Women and older men first. Tie it under your arms. I will pull you up." He secured one end of the heavy climbing rope around a massive, unbroken concrete pillar. He dropped the other end down the shaft. The extraction was brutal. Brian pulled them up one by one. His hands bled profusely. His shoulders ached with a dull, screaming pain. He did not stop. Rex stood at the edge of the hole, grabbing the collars of the exhausted guests with his teeth and pulling them completely over the ledge to safety. The dog worked tirelessly, dragging the survivors away from the unstable floor. They pulled up 29 people. The basement ceiling began to crack loudly. The mud shifted violently above them. Only one man was left at the bottom. It was Carter, the catering manager. He was frozen in sheer panic. His hands shook violently. He could not tie the knot. "I cannot do it," Carter screamed. "My hands will not work." Brian did not waste time with encouraging words. He wrapped the rope around his own waist. He rappelled straight down into the pitch-black basement. He hit the flooded floor. The water was up to his knees. He grabbed Carter by his torn shirt. He tied the rope tightly around the man's chest. "Climb!" Brian ordered. Brian pushed Carter upward while pulling himself up the rope hand over hand. The ceiling above them buckled sharply. A massive chunk of concrete fell, splashing heavily into the dark water. They reached the top just as the entire basement gave way with a deafening roar. The floor collapsed completely, swallowing the empty space below. Brian threw Carter over the edge. He pulled himself up onto the solid marble floor. He lay on his back, breathing heavily. Rex walked over. The dog licked the mud and blood off Brian's face. Brian reached up and rested his hand on the dog's wet neck. They had won. 2 hours later, the state police and heavy rescue teams finally cleared the highway. Red and blue emergency lights illuminated the devastated valley. Paramedics wrapped the survivors in thermal blankets. Marcus stood near an ambulance. He was treated for severe cuts and shock. He watched the paramedics tend to the wealthy guests. Not a single life was lost. He turned and looked for his brother. Brian was already gone. He did not stay for the flashing cameras. He did not stay for the gratitude of the billionaires. He and Rex walked quietly back up the treacherous, muddy trail toward the ridge. They left the chaos of the broken resort behind them. The morning sun broke through the heavy gray clouds as they reached the old hunting shack. The structure was battered, but it stood strong on the solid rock. Brian opened the door. He built a warm fire in the rusted stove. He poured fresh water into Rex's metal bowl. A man does not need an empire to be wealthy. He only needs a purpose, a solid foundation, and a loyal partner to stand beside him in the dark. Brian sat on the wooden floor next to the stove. Rex curled up tightly against his side, resting his heavy head on Brian's knee. They had everything they needed. The sun rose over the broken valley. It revealed a landscape of absolute devastation. The luxury resort was gone. It was replaced by a massive scar of brown earth and splintered wood. The news helicopters arrived at dawn. They circled like vultures over the ruins. Brian did not care about the helicopters. He sat on the porch of his shack. He drank black coffee from a tin cup. Rex lay at his feet, chewing on a thick pine branch. Down in the valley, the reality of the disaster set in. The rescue was a miracle, but the financial ruin was absolute. State inspectors arrived by noon. They looked at the shattered retaining walls. They looked at the forged geological reports. Marcus did not have answers. He sat in the back of an ambulance, covered in dry mud. He was not a king anymore. He was a criminal. The world moves fast when money is involved. By the end of the week, the development group filed for bankruptcy. The local government issued massive fines for environmental negligence. Marcus faced multiple lawsuits for reckless endangerment and fraud. He lost his custom suits. He lost his expensive cars. He lost every single dollar he had stolen from the family trust. The bank froze his accounts. The lawyers abandoned him. Brian did not go down to the town to watch his brother fall. A man of discipline does not need to celebrate the failure of others. He just needs to continue his own mission. Brian kept running his survival courses. The waiting list grew longer. The people who came to the mountain did not want to stay in luxury cabins anymore. They wanted to learn how to survive when the luxury failed. 2 weeks after the landslide, a black SUV navigated the muddy, repaired logging road. It stopped at the edge of the tree line below Brian's ridge. A man stepped out. He wore a simple jacket and hiking boots. He was older, perhaps 60. He looked up the steep trail. He started walking. Brian was chopping wood when the man arrived. Rex let out a low warning bark, but he did not show his teeth. The dog sensed no threat. Brian set his axe down. He wiped the sweat from his forehead. "It is a hard climb," Brian said. "It is harder when you are my age," the man replied. He breathed heavily. "My name is Arthur Pendleton. I am the chairman of the investment group that funded Pinnacle Peak." Brian nodded. He recognized the name. Arthur was one of the men he had pulled from the flooded basement. "I came to say thank you," Arthur said. "You did not stay for the cameras. You did not ask for a reward. You just pulled us out of the dark and disappeared." "I did my job," Brian said simply. "The dog did the rest." Arthur looked at Rex. The German shepherd stood tall, his coat shining in the afternoon sun. The dog looked nothing like the broken animal that had arrived in a metal crate months ago. "I have spent my entire life building things with concrete and steel," Arthur said. He looked out over the valley. "I thought money could control the earth. I was wrong. The only thing that held solid that night was you." Arthur reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a thick manila envelope. He handed it to Brian. "When the resort project collapsed, the land went into receivership," Arthur explained. "The bank was going to auction it off to cover Marcus's debts. I bought it. All of it. The valley floor, the lower ridge, and the original ranch property." Brian looked at the envelope. He did not open it. "It is yours," Arthur said. "The deeds are in your name. Free and clear. It is not a reward. It is a correction. Your brother stole your legacy. I am just putting it back where it belongs. Justice is rarely delivered by the legal system. The law is slow, blind, and easily manipulated by those with deep pockets. True justice is usually delivered by the quiet, undeniable force of character meeting opportunity." Brian opened the envelope. He saw the official county seals. He saw his own name printed on the property lines. He looked down at the paper. He felt the heavy weight of the past 12 years lift off his shoulders. The deployments, the loss, the cold nights in the shack. It all culminated in this single moment. "What will you do with it?" Arthur asked. "Rebuild the barn," Brian said without hesitation. "Expand the training grounds. Plant new trees where Marcus cut them down. Let the mountain heal." Arthur smiled. He extended his hand. Brian took it. They shook hands firmly. It was an agreement between two men who understood the true value of life. Arthur turned and began the long walk back down the trail. The construction of the new cabin began the very next month. Brian did not hire a massive contractor. He hired local carpenters from the valley town. They were honest men who worked with their hands and respected the wood. They laid a strong stone foundation. They raised thick, heavy logs. Brian worked right alongside them. He hammered nails. He carried beams. The physical labor was a different kind of healing. It was not the desperate survival of the winter. It was the purposeful creation of a future. Rex was always there. The dog patrolled the perimeter of the new construction site. He chased away coyotes. He sat near the warming fire while the men ate their lunch. The carpenters grew to love the dog. They brought him extra scraps of meat. They marveled at his discipline. Rex never begged. He only accepted what was given. By late spring, the snow melted completely, revealing the bright green grass of the pasture. The new cabin was finished. It had a wide front porch and a sturdy metal roof. Brian built a new red barn in the exact spot where the old one had stood. He bought 2 young horses. The ranch was coming back to life. The survival school, Ridgeline Tactical Survival, became the premier training facility in the country. Military units, corporate teams, and ordinary people came to the valley. They learned how to build fires. They learned how to navigate. Mostly, they learned how to trust themselves. Brian taught the classes, but Rex was the true star. The dog demonstrated tracking techniques that left seasoned veterans speechless. One evening in early summer, Brian stood on the new front porch. The sky was painted in brilliant shades of orange and purple. The air smelled like pine needles and fresh rain. He held a cup of coffee. He leaned against the sturdy wooden railing. He thought about Marcus. He heard his brother had taken a plea deal. Marcus was serving 3 years in a federal prison. Brian felt no anger anymore. Anger was a heavy burden, and Brian had laid it down a long time ago. Rex walked up the steps. The dog pushed his head under Brian's hand. Brian rubbed the dog's ears. He looked out over the vast green valley. He had reclaimed his father's legacy. He had not used expensive lawyers or dirty tricks. He had used the sheer, unbroken will of a soldier and the loyal heart of a dog. The world is full of broken things, but if you have the patience to rebuild them, they are often stronger at the broken places. Brian took a sip of his coffee. The mountain was quiet. The war was over. He was exactly where he belonged. Sometimes the world throws away what it considers broken, just like the military did with Rex and Marcus did with Brian. But true strength is not built in luxury. It is forged in the cold, hard dirt. I believe that when the ultimate storm arrives, it is never the money or the concrete that holds firm. It is the unbreakable bond between a loyal heart and a disciplined mind. Brian and Rex proved that you do not need an empire to be wealthy. You just need a purpose. May God bless you with the resilience to rebuild when life tears down your walls, and may He always provide a loyal companion to stand by your side in the darkest storms. If you believe that true character is built on a solid foundation, please comment Amen below. If this story inspired you, please like this video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of survival, redemption, and unbreakable bonds.